Hello everyone, today I'm going to introduce some fun and easy ways for children to write poems using Kenneth Koch's poetry ideas. I know there are lots of children being afraid of poetry writing, but believe me, because it's easy to follow and anyone can do it. As an English literature major, I have always been interested in teaching literature to children, and in Poetics Practicum course, I was able to learn different ways of teaching children poetry, and two books I got heavily influenced from were Rose, Where Did You Get That Red? Teaching Great Poetry to Children, and Wishes, Lies, and Dreams, Teaching Children to Write Poetry, both written by Kenneth Koch. Kenneth Koch was an American poet who showed passion in teaching poetry to children who were often marginalized and regarded inferior to adults. In this video, I would introduce mostly about poetry ideas about the first book, but also I want to share the third eye poem methods from the latter book as well, which was an entertaining way for kids to write poems. There are diverse poetry ideas in these books, but here I want to specifically share 3 ideas with examples written by children that I taught. Here, I'd like to briefly mention some information regarding poetry ideas according to Rose, Where Did You Get That Read?, which introduced some ways teachers can teach children poetry writing in association with adult poems. First, poetry ideas are means of making difficult and distant adult poems a part of children's own writing. The roles are to help children find perceptions, ideas, feelings, and new ways of saying things, and to acquaint them with some of the subjects and techniques that they could bring into their poetry. Children may ask questions that go beyond the given poetry ideas. For instance, in lessons about Blake, the poetry idea was asking a creature a question. Children who were so imaginative asked questions like, "Can I put answers?" With answers, a poem might look different from Blake's, but as far as it helps child believe in human or animal conversation, it is acceptable. Also, the purpose of poetry ideas is not to fully imitate adult poems, but rather recreate the main feelings of the adult poems. And most importantly, children should be excited about writing poetry with poetry ideas and be able to create their own poems. The writer points out some problems with poems in textbooks. The poem on the left is one such example. There is no serious emotion or complex viewpoints, and is simple and dull. Also, rhyme is used, but the poem is restricted and boring. On the other hand, what a 5-year-old kid really wrote was much more creative and sophisticated, containing emotions and different ways of looking at spring. The writer therefore reveals that children can compose creative poems, and great adult poems can help them enjoy and learn poetry. Teaching adult poems accompanies some difficulties. For textual difficulties, unfamiliar words, difficult concepts such as allusions and syntax were problematic. However, like the way children learn new words and concepts in order to play a game, children also loved learning meanings of unfamiliar words such as thee and thine. The next problem was regarding theme. Children will not understand every concept in a poem. Still, they can get inspiration even though they don't understand Neoplatonism in Donne's valediction. Also, many of adults' poems are long, but teachers could focus on certain parts of the poems. Koch says that teachers can also provide English translations to students, arguing that advantages such as the dreaminess, the music, the use of color, the contrast of original and translation itself overcome the limits of translation. Next, for those who found rhymes difficult, showing other forms that can be found in a poem, like the series of questions in Blake's The Tiger, and teaching both rhymed poems and unrhymed poems were suggested as solutions. Finally, for poems written in the language of the past, providing modern-day equivalents and encouraging children to use contemporary words that they really use were helpful. Koch's poetry ideas were practical and accessible to both teachers and students. However, one major difference between Koch's poetry lessons and my lessons was the fact that I had only about 20 minutes for teaching. Thus, I have come up with the following steps for my poetry writing lessons with children. First, before teaching kids, I composed my own poems first using the same poetry idea. This allowed me to see what were some difficulties in composing poems based on certain poetry ideas. Next, my professor asked graduate students to teach other classmates first. Teaching adults was easier, and I could be more organized and prepared when I taught kids thanks to their feedback. Next, during lessons, I explained poetry ideas which would be introduced shortly after. Then I gave students examples. At first, children were a bit reluctant in composing poems in English. To relieve their worries, it was essential to provide them with examples from books, poems that I had written before each lesson, and the ones written by their friends. After reading poems written by other children of their age, they got much excited and they were encouraged to write their own poems. Also, when they encountered some words that they do not know from these examples, I always told them just to neglect those words. I encouraged them that they could still understand the general tone or meaning of the poem without some words. Listening to their ideas, suggestions, and questions was essential too. Children always came up with things I have never thought of. My poetry lessons aimed to let them know the joy of poetry writing. They should be able to express their genuine emotions without being stressed out. Some proposals differed greatly from the original poetry ideas, but that was okay. The important thing was that they were writing their poems, raising their voices in them. After children finished their compositions, I always complimented their works. This was perhaps the most important part. Children often got worried about making mistakes in spelling or grammar. I didn't point out those minor errors. I complimented phrases and words that they chose and how creative their poems were. Then I took pictures of them. You may wonder why I took pictures, even though I didn't use all of them for my assignments. I always told them that since their poems were so great, I would proudly share their works with my English professor and classmates. Also, I let children read their poems out loud, and in this way, they built confidence in poetry writing and found the joy of it. These are some examples Kenneth Koch put in his book Rose, Where Did You Get That Red? He points out that children can love the importance of feelings and of one's secret imaginative life. Through poetry writing, they can freely express their emotions which were considered foolish or private. In this video, I want to share two poetry ideas using so-called adult poems, which are both highly amusing and easy to follow. First, the writer suggests write a poem in which you invite people, or only one person if you wish, to a magical, beautiful place full of sounds and colors, and where all kinds of marvelous things may happen. In each line of your invitation, you may want to put one sound or color, or maybe more. Shakespeare's songs stimulate children's fantasy, and they lead to a fresh, sensuous feeling for nature. Many children wrote a place where one can be free, showing desire to be free. Also, as it was so obvious that songs had rhymes, Koch let students use rhymes, but he didn't encourage nor restrict rhymes. Regarding the sound, a teacher may bring a musical instrument or play music to inspire students, yet mechanical aids should serve an auxiliary role, and it should never overwhelm Shakespeare. This is a poem that adopted the poetry idea of Shakespeare. It was written by a first-grade girl. Even though her place for the invitation is not a mysterious place but her home, it still is a creative poem, and she carefully observed sounds in her house. It is quite interesting that she initially wrote the sound of her dog's bark as oof oof, yet later changed them to oof oof, which is the expression that resembles the sound of barking more. Also, I love the ending of the poem, and everyone will say ah. This is obviously because her dog barks very loud and people will be irritated from her barking. Although this poem comprises only 4 lines, thanks to the words that describe sounds, I can vividly imagine a scene where people gather and have a nice friendly talk, yet her dog suddenly interferes with a loud bark. Another poetry idea can be in relation to Robert Herrick's The Argument of his book. Here the writer asks, write a poem about all the things you've written poems about, or that you'd like to write poems about. If you like, you can start every line with I write about, or I would like to write about. This kind of list poem is an easy way for children to write a poem. Children could write anything using their own imagination, and Koch pointed out diversity of subjects in Herrick's poem, like nature, flower, country, costumes, weddings, love, perfumes, times changing, and so on. Also, one notable theme from Herrick's was seemingly small and unimportant things, which suggests that themes of poems written by children varied greatly. While many of the poems written by Koch's students do not have the uniformity of theme, each line has words that are closely related to spring in this poem. The other first-grade girl is a close observer too. Her point of view moves between the sky and the land and even in between place where the whisper of cherry blossoms belong to. The poem also contains many words that created diverse sensory imageries such as whisper, auditory, cotton candy, visual and taste, and buzzing, auditory. The last line, bees buzzing, is using alliteration. Thus, readers can enjoy the music when they read the poem. And she did not intend to write this in alliteration since she had no idea about what it is. I did not teach that either. Still, she somehow seemed to understand the effect of it unconsciously and composed a line that has music in it. The title of the poem is also interesting as it is not simply put as spring. Indeed, from cherry blossoms and to cotton candy, we can see pink. Wishes, Lies, and Dreams is another fascinating book that is filled with good poetry ideas, which is less connected to adult poems but to more imaginative ideas. The author explains that children are mesmerized by the idea of physical transformation and special powers, and so did I. When I was an elementary school student, I read quite a lot of English books. I forgot most of them, obviously, but when I saw The Third Eye, there was this book that immediately came to my mind. The book is called Emily I. Finger's Secret Agent by Duncan Ball, and I assume that I read this when I was like 11. And as you can see, infer from the title, the protagonist helps two friends solve the mystery with her eye finger because she was born with an eye on the end of her forefinger. I believe that the fact that I still remember this novel is because as a kid I also fell in love with the idea of physical transformation. Isn't it exciting to think about having an extra eye? There are two conditions regarding the third eye, which is in the middle of your forehead. First, it could see what the two regular eyes could not see. Next, it only opens when the other two eyes are closed, so you can use your imagination and explore the world which we can't see with our real eyes. The poem on the left is written by a second-grade girl, and it focuses on seeing small objects. One thing I asked her was what she meant by the word letter, which could mean both character and message. Um, she argued that she had meant both meanings, but I didn't completely believe her argument because children are easily influenced by a teacher's words. When I asked the meaning of seeing people's blood, she expounded that the color of blood could be different, which is another imaginative line that adults could not easily think of. The poem on the right is also written by a second-grade boy, but as you can see, he had to use some Korean words in order to complete his poem because of his lack of English. Still, this is a remarkable piece because 3 months ago he couldn't even spell the word red properly. I had to teach him phonics all over again. But it only took him about 10 minutes to finish this work. I asked him what his feeling were when he was still composing lines, and he said, "I'm totally into it. This is so much fun." And as a novice teacher, his answers greatly relieved my worries. There are much more intriguing poetry ideas and examples written by children that I tutor, but I think I need to stop here for the sake of time. Here, I want to briefly share what I have found and learned from teaching poetry writing to kids. First is universality. In his book, Rose, Where Did You Get the Red? The writer shares his experiences of teaching poetry in foreign countries and how successful they were. I was also a bit worried when I found that I had to teach kids poetry in English, their second language, but it turned out surprisingly great. And no matter what kind of cultural backgrounds you are from and how fluently you can speak English, children can find joy in composing poems, even if they contain minor spelling or grammar errors. Next, these ideas are definitely a good way to start writing poetry for not only children but also adults as well. Shamefully, I have never written poetry in English, though I loved composing poems in Korean before taking this poetics practicum course. At first, I was also a bit terrified at the idea of writing a poem in English, but through following various poetry ideas by Kenneth, Koch, and others, I was able to write my own original poems. Also, children are so creative. Rather than mimicking given examples, children were capable of creating their own pieces using imagination that were simply beyond my expectation. Though they might be young, they could compose their own poems without the intervention of adults. Sometimes it took me many hours to write a poem. Even though there were no given rules, I ended up thinking about its form or structure and the uniformity of the theme. It would be more proper to say that I struggled with creating some poems, and they were often full of boring cliches. Yet children easily and happily wrote poems, which made me wonder how big their worlds of imaginations were. What I liked about Koch's poetry ideas was the fact that there was much freedom. As mentioned in the book, poems in textbooks were somewhat childish and didn't seem to have many creative expressions. On the other hand, poems written by his students showed much original ideas and themes. In the process of poetry writing, children were not subjects that simply followed teachers' instructions. Rather, they have actively participated in discussions and asked brilliant questions about poetry ideas to the author. He recognized their wishes to go even beyond the given ideas and let them write a poem in a way that they wanted to. I agree with the writer's view that the purpose of poetry ideas is to help children write a poem of their own. Thus, variations of poetry ideas contributed to creating even more creative poems written by young children. Lastly, children's poems gave me inspirations too. I wrote many poems based on conversation I had with them. Some of the ideas were from their silly questions, which made me laugh so hard. After having all these lessons, what I realized is that the dichotomy of a teacher and a student do not exist in the world of poetry. Anyone can be a teacher, anyone can be a student, and anyone can be a poet. These two books were great sources that I referred to, and you can even transform ideas into more original ones. I hope this video will encourage and give inspiration to those who want to exercise poetry writing with children, especially around this time when they spend much time indoors. Thank you for listening.